This is our second panel of the day, and again, we've got the privilege of having David with us for this panel, and it's a very important panel on energy security in the global context. Our Senator Ross Cadell, who's going to be here to introduce the panel, unfortunately is quite sick, so he's not coming, but I've invited Dean to do that. So Dean is going to, I'll pass it on to Dean to introduce all our speakers who are here today, who are experts in their own right in industry. 1 minute.
Thank you very much, Christine. Well, I'm going to do half the job because I'm going to delegate the other half of the job to Senator Van, who's my colleague in the Australian Senate. But since COP26, a number of significant events have happened, and I think we've all been surprised by the nature of the events, but also the pace in which they've changed the international environment. Of course, top of mind is the invasion of the Ukraine. In addition to that, the growing and very obvious presence of Chinese influence across the Indo-Pacific region. On the domestic front, we've had a change of government here in Australia, destabilisation of the British Prime Minister and all that that will involve, and of course, growing loss of confidence, I'd argue, in the Biden administration and their ability to respond in an effective way to many of these changing international environments. In the Australian Senate, we have our own United Nations Senator. His name is Senator David Van. David sits on the Joint Foreign Affairs and Trade Committee, the Senate Foreign Affairs and Trade Committee, also the Joint Standing Committee on Trade and Investment. In addition to that is the chair of the Parliamentary Friendship Group on the Ukraine, but also Spain and Thailand, Mexico.
Pacific Islands.
There we go, and the Pacific Islands. So David is prolific in his Senate contributions, earnest in his approach to the Senate committee work, which is a very, very important feature of the Australian Parliament, and I'm delighted to welcome David, and he will moderate this session and introduce the speakers.
I think the Right Honourable has already been well introduced today, but I thank you for appearing on this panel, David. It's wonderful to have you here. If anyone doesn't know who David is, please put your hand up. I think goes without saying. Next to David, we have Bryce Wakefield, who is the Director of the Australian Institute of International Affairs, which is Australia's oldest foreign affairs think tank. I think it's even the oldest think tank in Australia, I think so, yeah, from memory. So an expert in international affairs. I thought good for this panel to be able to give us some of that geopolitical context and help shape some of this the debate we're about to have. Next to Bryce, we have Fiona Simon, who is the chair of the Australian Hydrogen Council. Hydrogen being one of the fuels that we're going to need in the future if we're going to meet our emissions targets, but also an important fuel to be able to shore up our energy security. And I'll get onto energy security and what that actually means in a minute. And next to Fiona, we have Simon Sharples from the Australian Petroleum Production and Exploration Association. So welcome the panel, and I think we're in for quite an interesting discussion going forward. Firstly, I think it's important to talk about what energy security actually is. We're seeing at the moment higher prices, and that's certainly a major part of that. But is that affecting energy security here in Australia? I'd argue no. I'm old enough, and some of the other Victorians in the room might remember back in 1998 when the gas plant down at Longford blew up. And it knocked out gas to the state for 2 weeks. I was Johnny on the spot for the organisation that's now known as AEMO, and I handled that crisis for those 2 weeks and then advised the Victorian Government through the Royal Commission that was called into that crisis. That was a period, it was only 2 weeks, but people didn't have gas for cooking, and Melbourne, or Victoria, is a very gas-dependent state. Cheap natural gas out of Bass Strait virtually built all the industry in Victoria. The people didn't have gas for hot showers, they didn't have gas for cooking, people were stood down from their jobs. So a lot of the things that we saw recently during COVID happened in Melbourne only 20 odd years ago. So I'd argue that's more of an energy security issue rather than what we're seeing at the moment with high prices. What we're seeing now in Europe, I think is a different matter. And if you look at the geopolitical context and what's happening, where one country invading another one is having a significant impact, not just on that country that's invaded, but I'd argue all of Europe and more broadly across the globe. What we're seeing across the globe is higher energy prices. We're seeing shortages of food because you don't just need gas and fuel for heating and electricity. You also need it for fertilisers, you need it for transporting food. So there's the knock-on effects of any global crisis is going to have major impacts on humanity, not just on that particular region. So I thought it might be interesting, first and foremost, to get from Bryce a bit of an overview of how he's seeing the crisis in Ukraine and the impacts that that's having on the rest of the region and the world.
Great, thanks, David. And it's really good to be here, I have to say, and I really appreciate the invitation. So thank you very much. Look, I'm going to start off with a sort of an assessment of Russia, if you like, and then move on to what I see as four broader dangers in the situation that we're facing now. And I want to start with the notion of Russia as a petrostate, which is something that Australians don't really recognise from time to time. Russia is sort of, seen as far away. I mean, people in this room might, but in the general consciousness, it's sort of dismissed from time to time. Belgium with nuclear weapons, if you like. But petrochemicals are very tightly bound to the fate of energy in Russia, and that's in terms of production and prices. When those factors go in their favour, Russia generally feels pretty confident and generally feels like it can push its weight around its geopolitical area. This shouldn't surprise us. Some 60% of Russia's exports are gas and oil. Its revenues, government revenues, are largely based on gas and oil, most of which is, of course, exported to Europe. So I think that leads into my suggestion that this is not the first time that we have seen this sort of thing, let's say. As I said, higher oil prices lead to greater confidence among Russian government actors. We probably saw it in the 1970s. You could argue that higher oil prices and greater confidence in Moscow was a factor in the invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. You can see growing oil prices across from the early 2000s as adding to a greater sense of Russia's confidence. It's acting out in Chechnya, in Georgia, in Ukraine in 2014, and finally now. So what this might seem to suggest is that if we want some sort of stability, if we want to perhaps if we want a world where there isn't this confident actor, this confident authoritarian actor throwing its weight around the region, then that's an argument for shifting away from petrochemicals. And that will be hard, of course. There are issues with, for example, a move to EVs and hydrogen and battery storage. For example, Russia, like China, sits on a lot of critical minerals, but it's not impossible. We can develop alternatives to that. And one of the themes that I'm picking up in this conference is that a lot of the delegates here are looking for ways to convince their colleagues in the Liberal Party of how to make that shift. And one of the narratives that one can hook into is Scott Morrison's call for a sort of a resistance to an axis of authoritarianism. If you want to resist authoritarian regimes that sit on petrochemicals, then perhaps we should be thinking about ways of moving away from them. So that's a brief sort of discussion of Russia, what I want to point out are four dangers of this new situation in terms of shifting to hydrochemicals. One is that the focus on what is now very much a traditional security state versus state situation may well shift the world's attention away from a climate change agenda, and also in particular areas. The military is a major consumer of petrochemicals, and there will be people arguing that the greening of the military now shouldn't happen, or we should slow down the greening of the military because doing so will lead to less efficiency in terms of warfighting. I was encouraged to see at the Shangri-La Dialogue Sir Ben Key, who is the First Lord of the British Navy, saying that it's not an either-or situation. We can actually move to greener militaries without sacrificing efficiency. Three more. Now, I was encouraged earlier this morning by the panel on trade that talked about talked about encouraging open trade. However, there has been a sort of fanciful notion that we can compete with China in certain areas and cooperate with China in certain others. And the war in Ukraine has led to a sort of tightening of the relationship between China and other countries, particularly the US. That's going to lead to, and it already has, led to a downgrading of the ability of foreign researchers to cooperate with Chinese researchers, which is justified in national security terms, but does also slow down the pace at which we can cooperate on green energy. I've got one more, but I've got two more, but I'll just, as I'm running out of time, I'll skip to my last one. I think it's really important that in our focus on fuel security, we don't forget, as David has already said, that this is a nexus, that there are a whole load of resources that are not just fuel, that whose supply is affected by this, and they all tie into climate change in one form or another. And the big one that I would focus on is water, because of course you need water to create fossil fuels, you need water to create hydrogen, you need water for food security as well, and of course water is affected by changes to the climate. So we can't simply focus on oil and gas as the only resource that is implicated in fuel security issues.
Thanks, Bryce. David, let's move to, this is your backyard that we're talking about, an area that you have had an awful lot of experience in. Now, we've seen that the EU have changed their defence postures due to Russia, and new members possibly joining NATO and the like. But we haven't seen blocks on the use of Russian oil and gas. There's 1.6 million barrels a day of shipborne oil that's going to be blocked, but there is still a lot of Russian oil and gas flowing into Europe. How do you see Europe doing more to tackle this energy crisis?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't underestimate what Europe has done. I mean, you're absolutely right that the EU countries, not particularly Britain, but lots of EU countries became far too reliant on Russian oil and gas, and that was a mistake. We can talk about how that happened and what we do about it. But so, first point is, don't underestimate the extent to which the EU has actually acted. I mean, they're talking about cutting demand during the course of this year for Russian gas by over 2/3, blocking the import, embargoing the import of Russian oil together by the end of this year. I mean, they are taking very big steps, together with other strategic things you see, Norway Finland and Sweden joining NATO. That's a massive change. Germany rearming, spending 100 billion euros on its defence budget. Big changes have been made. And I think the relationship with Russia won't snap back to something approaching normality even after this appalling invasion ends and hopefully is defeated. So don't underestimate what's happened. But yes, big lessons to learn, I think. I would quibble a bit with your definition of energy security. Energy security really is two things. It is the physical availability of energy sources, which is vitally important, but also the price, because to our constituents, when, as in my country is happening right now, gas prices are shooting up and heating prices are shooting up, and it's now over £100 to fill up your car, that is deep energy insecurity for those families. So I think there's lots of lessons to learn. I think the big lesson, though, I hope we don't get this wrong, particularly at this conference, is, in my view, climate change progress and energy security, they should go together. I mean, I think it's important this because we would be more secure if we had more homegrown renewable energy. We were less dependent on hydrocarbons from dangerous places in the world. We would be more secure if we have longer term, cheaper supplies of energy. That's hugely important. Now, of course, when prices spike, as has happened, and when there's an availability crunch, it's quite right for countries to ask themselves, are we, where we have domestic supplies of gas, unrecovered in the North Sea or available for fracking or what have you, are we doing our bit to recover those sources because they are necessary? And as I said earlier, it's better to exploit your own gas than to bring it in from Qatar or Trinidad or Saudi Arabia or wherever. That's a perfectly reasonable conservative response. What I think is a dangerous conservative response is to say, energy security is the new problem, forget climate change, let's drill baby drill, forget the climate. That would be a big mistake because our constituents would think, as soon as there's a challenge, you gave up on climate change altogether, you just snap back to the old things. So I think there are political dangers. How did Europe get this so wrong? It is frustrating because in 2014, when Putin invaded Crimea effectively, there was a whole set of things that European countries could have done. And I actually tabled a paper at the European Council saying, right, let's build interconnectors between Algeria and Spain, let's have flows between Spain and France, let's have reverse flows through Slovakia, both ways to Russia and away from Russia. All these steps we could have taken. And the problem with this issue of energy security, most of the things you have to do are very long term, quite expensive, and there always seems to be reasons not to do them and to do other things instead. And I think the great lesson here is we live in a very unstable world. This time it's Russia, next time it could be something else, and energy security needs to climb up the political agenda. It shouldn't conflict with climate change, but conservative governments all over the world should be thinking, right, let me do a proper audit, not just of what sources of energy we have available, not just what are the physical risks to them, but what are the political risks to them. And I think if we do all those things and really examine our supply chains, I mean, here's an admission for you. Britain imports very little Russian gas. Obviously, we're being hit massively by the increase in the gas price. But one of the things that has emerged is we import huge amounts of diesel from Russian refineries. Now, there's no particular reason for that. We could refine our own diesel. But it just happened that, so for anyone in politics, I think I said this last night about something else, don't think that just setting the energy security strategy is enough. You've got to get right into the logistics. I think politicians today are going to have to understand the supply chains in far more detail and really work out what the dangers and what the risks are. So I think those are the ways to sort of think about it for the future.
And I couldn't agree more. And I don't think there's anyone in this room that's suggesting an either-or approach to this. And obviously, Australia is a net energy exporter. We're the third biggest energy exporter in the world, and we fund a lot of what we're going to be doing in terms of climate change and adaptation from those revenues and royalties, some of which come from Simon's members and who are currently seeing the spikes, even though they're exporters, or a lot of them are exporters of gas to the rest of the world. We're seeing those same prices here. An interesting fact that with the LNG industry that Australia's built, which is I think it's $86 billion worth of exports every year, funds a lot of government revenues to replace the energy that it would take to take the electricity out of that and make it out of renewables. It's about 12,000 square kilometres of solar PV. So now that's not an undoable thing in a country the size of Australia, but it's a massive challenge. So do you want to talk about some of the challenges that you're seeing with your members and how they're looking at this adaptation?
Yeah, sure. I think just to take on what David was saying, I think the membership that we sort of represent are doing things hand in hand. I think it's really important to recognise that. COVID has probably given you a bit of a reset, more people spending time at home. I can touch on prices a bit later if you want to have that conversation. But I think, you know, from a geopolitical context, Australia as a size, population-wise, relative to the resources we have, if there wasn't an export market, you actually wouldn't get the gas out of the ground. And so there's a challenge to try and find, you know, whether it's a reservation policy, whether it's APPEA or whatever it is, you know, and I saw a chart in the taxi on the way here actually that talked about East Coast gas prices, you know, and Queensland being in one spot, New South Wales and then Victoria. But there's probably a real reflection, if I just talk about gas in isolation, I can come back to the broad energy picture, that if you've got bans in New South Wales and Victoria, the gas supply and the price you pay is going to be the cheapest when you're closest to the market. So if you're paying $6 a gigajoule in Queensland and it costs you $4 or $5 to pipe down to Victoria, the price is naturally going to go through the transition. And so I think energy security is an interesting concept, because I think in Australia we are actually quite lucky that we do have a lot of security. It's just right now in the current environment, if we talk about the challenges, there's been, you know, a lot of plans around ESG, early shutting down of coal terminals, scheduled maintenance. I think I read that there's about 800 megawatts short through May and June around just coal generation. And so what happens in the gas market is you have 85%, maybe 90% of actual gas that's sold into the domestic market on long-term sales contracts, which means the spot market's actually quite shallow. So when you're seeing prices at $600 a gigajoule, it's actually only reflective of a small portion. The market can move up and down in a quite volatile fashion. And so, you know, when you're hearing prices quoted, it's actually not what's being paid. And the other thing I would reflect, probably 2 points around price and energy security. From a European perspective, if you think about Denmark, who relies, I think it's about 97% on wind, they are 45% above the average European electricity price, and they're at a highly renewable state. So I think England's at about 36%. Scotland, the UK more generally has a lot of renewables in the system, and so David and I were chatting outside, and I said I think the saying "many hands make light work" is never truer than it has been today. And the energy security is going to take a lot of components to work together in this ecosystem to move forward in that sense.
My old organisation I used to work for, APPEA, as I said before, they every 2 years, I believe it is, they put out an integrated strategy plan for how to meet the government's needs or the nation's needs for energy, and as well now that they've started factoring in bringing down emissions as well. And their draft one, it's just their draft one for 2022, they talk about to be able to take out oil and gas, or gas and petrol currently consumed in transport, industry, office and domestic use. We're going to have to go from 180 terawatt hours of electricity to 330 terawatt hours per year of electricity. Now that's both a lot of solar PV or other forms of electricity. And to Fiona, that doesn't include the pathway to hydrogen. Now, I probably argue I'm the most bullish person on hydrogen in this room, possibly next to yourself. I think it is not only going to be our saviour from a bringing down emissions point of view, but also from replacing or at least adding to our net energy exports. So I think we are quite likely to go from third largest energy exporter in the world to one or two once we get our hydrogen industry up and running. Can you give us a snapshot of where you think we are at the moment? We talked earlier about partnerships. We've got partnerships with Korea, with Japan, with Germany. I was in Bangkok on Thursday talking to some parliamentarians. They want to do a partnership with Australia on hydrogen. Hydrogen's one of these things that is going to save us from this dilemma that we have in both energy emissions, but energy security as well. Can you give us a snapshot of where you think we are now and how soon are we going to get there?
I'm always having to temper the enthusiasm with a sense of the challenges, and and that is in itself a challenge when you're in my role, because I'm supposed to be there as the champion and the cheerleader for hydrogen. But I don't think it helps if people think it's all going to be easy and it's all going to be free, or that it's going to be something that doesn't take a while. So, because then everyone gets to turn around. I mean, we know potentially you're playing directly into fossil fuel interests who are like, oh, well, we gave it a try, didn't quite manage. So what can we do to paint a realistic picture? So I probably am not the most bullish person in the room. It might help for those who are less familiar with hydrogen to actually take a step back and actually explain why that is a molecule that we need to be looking at, so that it's not just about electrify everything or hydrogen kind of hype cycle and fighting on LinkedIn that I often see, and really stop myself from going in there and calling people names. But so essentially, hydrogen is a molecule. You can make it in a variety of ways. As you've heard, we make it right now with fossil fuels. As a molecule, as opposed to just the electrons that we have in electricity, it provides a means of long-term storage and storage through space and time. So it is a means of replacing that which liquid fuels have done so well, and gas as well. And so it means you can stick it in a container, you can keep it forever. You can move it in vast distances. So it helps. And because you can make it clean and you can make it green, then we now have that solution to the long-term and over long distances aspect that liquid fuels has given us. And because it's made and not found, we are not then reliant on those particular relationships with those particular countries or those shipping routes that we all feel some vulnerability about. So it has these benefits, but I'm not in the business of arguing hydrogen for everything. You can replace all of your current liquid fuels and gaseous use, but there's really, I wouldn't argue that's what you should do, because it is in itself a process which means you're using an enormous amount of electricity. The process of making hydrogen means that when you then turn it back into a fuel, you've got much less energy than what you had to start with from the electricity. So if you can electrify, you should. The good news is there's an awful lot left over for those who want to see the hydrogen industry get up, and that's all those areas where using electricity directly or a battery is less feasible to the point of being infeasible. So we're talking there about maritime fuels, yes, syn fuels for aviation, assuming biofuels aren't enough. Certainly, there's still debate about heavy road transport, but there are serious entities out there right now saying the only way to again move through space and time, as in the distances and the period over which a tank will get you, is actually going to be using hydrogen. So I hope that wasn't too basic for you all, but it is in itself then a very meaningful part of the energy mix to get to net zero, complementing existing more variable forms of energy like using direct electricity and batteries. So in terms of where we're seeing it, we are in a very hyper-rich environment, and there's a sort of yin and yang to it, because hydrogen is so versatile, because you can use it in all these different ways, because there are the different ways of making it, and people are seeing it, their get out of jail free kind of card there about managing how they're getting out of fossil fuels. It does mean that there's a cacophony of voices all talking about why hydrogen is the thing, and then they've all got their particular case. And it makes it quite challenging for someone to come in and form a comprehensive and objective view. So that's, but that's also a great thing because it's built the profile. It means people are having the conversations. In terms of where we are, I think we still haven't committed properly. We're still caught up in the enthusiasm. So, and I mean that globally. There is a lot to be done, we ran a conference 2 weeks ago, so we are very much at the heart of the problem. But you know, I go to every conference about hydrogen, and we all talk. You know, and we rhapsodise about it and how collaboration and coordination is so important because we've got a lot to do and better get cracking now. And that's what every conversation is. And you think, gosh, I really hope you're having proper conversations behind the scene. I hope you're doing deals. We need to see the deals done. We are pre-commercial. There is no argument based on people wanting to make money right now in investing in hydrogen. It involves there needing to then be a means of people valuing that which is external, so price the externality in. It has to be a carbon price of some description. I think that we will stay in the world of hype unless we start to see genuine policy gusto from governments. But, you know, I spent 20 years in energy retail, living and breathing, you know, the dream of fights over energy affordability. And, you know, energy ministers are ministers for keeping the lights on and keeping prices down, first and foremost. So how can we tell the hydrogen story within that overall environment and without falling foul of the worst of the politics? And to be honest, I think the more we talk about hydrogen for industrial use, for the lower regrets areas where we already use it, say in the making of fertiliser, you know, ammonia for explosives as well, that also quarantines it really from everyday voters if it's an industrial piece, and get to scale that way. Because there's a lot of people out there saying, let's start a consumer movement, let's get it into everyone's homes. And already the AEMO ISP hydrogen superpower, because their particular remit is the energy system, and they took a very aggressive view of what it could all be. They've then painted this extreme version that people either buy into or think is ridiculous, and also requires an enormous amount of transmission infrastructure to be built. And then I've already had low-income consumer reps come to me going, are we paying for this? I'm thinking, actually, no, you're not supposed to. This is not the message. So we could still be undone because of people's concerns about prices, and we really need to find a way of managing that.
And you know, the ISP talks about, you know, I think it, about $10 billion in transmission costs that
who's paying for that?
Just to you know to get us there. David, you've mentioned a couple of times CCS. I'm going to play devil's advocate here for a bit. With the two of you at the end of the room, should we be using fossil fuels to be making hydrogen and capturing the carbon? Is that going to help kickstart the industry, and is that going to help that commercialisation get across that valley of death, as it's sometimes known?
I'm a bit out of date on this, and I'd actually defer to Fiona on this. I mean, my experience as Prime Minister, where we basically put money and pump primed every part of green industry. So we put money into offshore wind, we put money into carbon capture and storage, into solar. We basically created a subsidy regime in order to get these things going. And some were wildly successful. Offshore wind, I think, is my sort of favourite because it started at £150 a kilowatt hour and came rapidly down to 50 and is now, you know, being built, you know, unsubsidised. And we've got this massive industry in Britain of building wind turbines and all the skills that go with it. And the one that actually I withdrew from was carbon capture and storage, because I'm sure it will work and the technology is proved, but we seem to be a long way away from a commercial answer. And politics, as the French Prime Minister many years ago said, you know, to govern is to choose. You've got to make your choices. And you know, if you've got £1 billion, we were investing several £1 billion into carbon capture and storage, and we put an end to that programme, and we've redirected the money into things that were going to yield results faster. So I think I'd defer on where, you know, we know the technology can work, but it's technology plus cost. So I'll defer to the experts on it. That said, I'm a great believer in the hydrogen story, particularly on, you know, I like examples where you can try and convince people that we can go on having growth, but it's going to be green growth. And I think iron and steel, you know, steel production is 10% of global emissions. And if you move to totally green steel via hydrogen, and one day that can be green hydrogen, you can go on driving nice cars, making them and all the rest of it, and with zero emissions. So it's a very hopeful story. But I think I'll let the experts decide whether it's carbon capture and storage that gets us there, or whether we have to move faster to green hydrogen using the other renewable resources that we have. I'd love also, can I throw you a question, which is there a carbon price? You said you need a carbon price effectively to make hydrogen work. Can you put a number on that?
No. Probably more than what we currently have for our voluntary market. And even then, it's not even. I just mean valuing carbon. Even if we could have fuel standards, for example. We don't have fuel standards at the right level. So they can be sector-specific targets, and I think these days that might even be more palatable than a carbon price, which would be quickly branded a carbon tax possibly, and go through all the unpleasantness of that. In terms of blue, there's a blue versus green debate which is playing out globally. It's a highly moralistic and virtue signalling debate. It is not helpful. It doesn't mean that if you are, it's too bad if to be agnostic or open to CCS, it then paints you into the place where you are now one of the bad guys who wants to extend fossil fuels, but that's the way the debate is going. We at Australian Hydrogen Council do have, we're a reasonably broad church. Personally, it would make my life much easier to be all about the green and talking purely about electrolysers, but there are great number of assumptions that are, and hopeful assumptions that are made about how we get to scale with green, and those people then criticise the blue people and say, but you're making assumptions about CCS, and similarly the CCS people would be right to say, and you're making some assumptions about electrolysis. So I think that it would be nice to not have to use fossil fuels. It would be nice to be able to be on the side of the angels on this one. On the other hand, the whole perfection is the enemy of progress, or whatever the phrase is. It's too bad if we let the whole thing fall over because we're waiting for the perfect solution.
Hence why I think it's an important question for this room.
Well, we need CCS. Like that, all the evidence that goes to saying we need CCS. I'm not even talking about for hydrogen. Like it's considered part of how you get to net zero.
Sure.
The question appears to be one of being able to capture it responsibly. And in the end, if you've got the right measurement approach, then it really doesn't matter if there's a certain point above which people will not tolerate or will not buy a fuel that has a certain carbon emission point, then so be it. And then whether it's CCS or something else that did that.
Which was one of the important conversation points this morning about multilateralism and WTO and being able to, in Australia, if we become a leader, and I think we will become a leader in hydrogen production and export, helping set the standard for what that looks like. What does green, blue, what are the standards, and how do you price it differently at those levels as well? Obviously, there's other ways of, hydrogen, as you say, is just a form of energy storage and transport. Electricity, we can make lots of electricity, but it's very hard to store. Obviously, you can do it in things such as pumped hydro. You can do it in aluminium. I think hopefully you'll all see I've said in Parliament many times, I hate single-use plastic water bottles, so I had these ones made. A little bit of branding on them, but only a little bit. Green aluminium, green steel, or probably for Australia, more importantly, moving towards green iron. We've got these huge iron ore mines in WA with millions of acres of sunshine around them. Now, I don't think Australia should be moving towards green steel because we'd be annoying some of our partners in Japan and Korea. But shipping them green iron is an incredibly easy way to ship energy. You're literally taking energy and turning it into something that we can export. It's a new industry for us. An interesting fact that if we were to ship iron ore and hydrogen to those countries to make, for every ship of iron ore we send, we're going to have to send them 6 ships of hydrogen. So for every ship of iron ore, we should 6 of hydrogen for them to do it from there. So it's a far smarter way to be able to talk about shipping energy if we're doing some of that value add here in Australia using some of those renewable sources, which is incredibly within Australia's remit and our skill sets to be able to do. Now, part of the problem that we have is 90% of solar PV comes out of China. What happens if, let's say, for example, there is an issue with China and all of a sudden Australia is at war, or there is a conflict going on somewhere in the Indo-Pacific, and we're no longer getting PV out of China? What does that start to do to our energy security? Anyone?
Well, as I said, I think analysing our supply chains is just a way. I mean, it used to be like an issue that no politician ever really addressed. Things just arrive just in time. There's no doubt that, I mean, the fact that Chinese specialised in making solar radically reduced the cost. We started off by subsidising it very highly. I cut the subsidies every year because they were becoming less and less necessary. But we're definitely living in a world now where you've got to understand much more about your supply chains and what the alternatives are. And I think in politics, the sort of nexus of food security, energy security, national security, these are going to be absolutely top topics. So I think you have to put that alongside everything else you do. But I hope it doesn't mean we sort of think, well, we're not going to invest in solar because it's coming from a risky part of the world. I don't think there's, we should carry on doing that, but start thinking about what are the alternative supply chains, alternative production centres. I think it's going to be a very big part of the picture.
And it's not like we haven't been here before again, right? Because, in 2010, China would state otherwise, but China cut off critical minerals to Japan. Well, what did Japan do? Japan found either alternative ways of building what they needed to build, or alternative supply of minerals. There are other suppliers. It's just that up until now, China has been the easier supplier. So we have to find alternative supply chains and
I think it's safe to say that both Quad and AUKUS. Those rare earths and critical minerals are part of our attraction to both the UK, US, Japan and India. I was at a dinner with the chair of the Observer Research Forum, Samir Saran, on Sunday. Bryce was there as well. And he was making the point that that's very much part of what India is looking at. And if some of that PV production could go to countries like India, like Vietnam, troubled countries like Sri Lanka, probably a little bit more difficult at the moment, but there is plenty of options for that production to go to allow us to move to some of these cleaner energies that are both going to reduce Australia's emissions, but also help our export industries.
I was just going to say, I think it's important to reflect on this point around energy security and supply chain analysis, because India will be probably the fastest growing economy in the next, through to 2030. And so there are potential solutions there. The work just needs to be done to analyse it. But from an Australian context, we have a domestic issue, but then you've got to reflect on, it's estimated that the number of global megacities in the world, so population cities of 10 million or more, will grow from 34 to 48, and 11 of them will be directly within our region. And so when we talk about things like hydrogen, green steel, carbon capture, whatever it might be, I'm not going to sit here and say more supply, more gas, dig, or whatever the saying was that David used earlier, but there's actually an opportunity here for Australia, and you can actually shore up your supply and your security through analysis of supply chains. But you can also be a region leader or the leading state in the region to actually then help decarbonise and support energy security in other countries as well.
Yeah, Fiona, did you have a point?
Yeah, the thing with hydrogen as well is that it does actually help you both across the three areas So it helps you with energy security because you can make it yourself, and because lots more places can make it than where it's currently extracted and sent. So even if you're a country that can't make vast quantities of it, you can rely on a much more diverse range of partners. So we don't have that problem, but others do. That's why they want to import from us. There's also the fact that it's not even all about energy. So hydrogen is the where you start to make ammonia. Ammonia is fertiliser, or is a form of fertiliser. And there's been analysis that says like half the world's population wouldn't exist if we didn't have nitrogen-based fertilisers. We know that we're heading into a food security issue. Russia and Ukraine are each major exporters of fertiliser and the food that comes from it. So whilst we aren't going to get to scale tomorrow and in hydrogen for a number of purposes, because then you've got to say if we're putting in all the renewable electricity and you've already had to fight for that on top of decarbonising the local economy, well then is it for the steel, all this electrolysis, what is the first purpose for it? Even within hydrogen may not be food. But the point is if we get to scale and we think we can use it, we can make it for all sorts of purposes, Australia could play a key role in helping support the world's food security. And then on a national security perspective, there's the engagements that we're having as we're seeing the world move toward sort of democracies versus autocracies, or the natural kinship that is there between similar nations. We're talking to, Australia, talking to the US and the UK, and Europe is talking about importing hydrogen, or at least a hydrogen derivative. The Germans are super keen to do that. These are countries that we might not export to but would share information with, like the US. This could be part of the Quad conversations. This helps support our national security in our region as well. So hydrogen has this really a really important role to play within all of those conversations, and really just involves then people grasping the scale of it and getting going.
I don't think there's a conversation I have in the foreign affairs or trade space that hydrogen doesn't come up. I can't remember the last time I had a conversation where hydrogen and people wanting to partner with Australia to at least work, if not on the technology, because there's all sorts of, there's not just the direct electrolysis, there's different pathways to it, whether we using just solar PV, or whether there's direct collector heat generation, steam generation, wind. David, you'll be pleased to know that we passed legislation late last year to legalise offshore wind here in Australia, and there's a major project that's being built, or they're scoping out being built off the coast of Victoria, my home state at the moment. We hope that it replicates what it's done in your country. It's an incredibly important part of the energy mix that I think Australia is going to profit from extremely well, far better than onshore wind ever will, as I think you agreed earlier. Any closing remarks on
just a couple of things we haven't mentioned, I suppose, that are worth sort of putting into the sort of future manifesto. One is green tech, where there's so much fascinating work coming out of our universities, and I'm sure yours too, on how do you reduce the use of rare earth minerals in batteries, how do you make battery technology work better. Smart grids is something we haven't mentioned. The cheapest power station is the one you don't have to build, because you've actually managed to make your electricity system work better, and how you can make sure that we have sort of interactive smart grids. If we're all going to have battery cars, there's ways of, you recharge the car when you're at work, the car helps power the fridge when you're out, all the stuff. But I mean, I think thinking of those things and the role of green tech, because I think it's also quite an exciting agenda. I think the presentation, which I missed half of, but I came in for from Climate Works, I thought what was so fascinating about that is just how fast the technology is moving. And all countries and all politicians should be thinking, how do we be part of that? Are we doing enough on incubators and accelerators and encouraging entrepreneurship and the finance and tax arrangements around that? How are we helping those businesses grow and scale and get through the valley of death and all the rest of it? So I think that should be part of it's actually part of energy security, as well as about entrepreneurship and jobs and green tech and the rest of it. So I think those are the only other things we haven't really talked about in this agenda. But I would just come back to the main point, which is, beware those that want to use energy security to drag you away from climate change. You've got to try and get the two to go together, because ultimately a more secure, cheaper system will be one that is actually helping to reduce emissions, rather than one that is, in our case, using too much of oil and gas from dangerous parts of the world.
Couldn't agree more. And I think this session was important because hopefully we've shown you can't separate out energy security and emissions reduction from what's happening around the world. Now, geopolitical context is everything, because even with the abundant supply that we have here in Australia, we're still feeling those gas prices.
I was used to feel as Prime Minister that energy security matters more to a Prime Minister than to almost anybody else, because the truth is, if you go and buy a car and you can't get the car till tomorrow, that's not the end of the world. But if you go and switch the lights on and they don't come on, that is an absolute disaster. And I tell you, it's the biggest disaster for, and that's the person who's running the country. So I was always, it's a sort of obvious point, but it's worth making, because of course you have to ask yourself, does anyone else care about this as much as I do? And when you're talking to everyone in the energy industries and the people who run the grid and all the rest of it, and they say, well, we think we'll be all right this winter. There's a bit of a narrow margin, but we think we're going to be okay. That's when your blood turns to ice, and you wonder whether they really have got it sorted out. So in all your discussions and all your thinking about how you rebuild as an opposition and into government, that part of energy security, that they must never go out. It was very important.
It was interesting that last week all the energy ministers got together with the new energy minister, and all of a sudden, now that electricity and gas prices have gone through the roof, all of a sudden they're accepting of a capacity market, something that we've been arguing for certainly the last 3 years that I've been in Parliament.
Yeah.
I'd like to thank the whole panel, but David, these are a pair of senators' cufflinks that only senators can buy, but can I give them to you as a gift on behalf of my fellow senators?
Thank you very much.
And wear them when you're next wandering around in Westminster and see. Oh no, I've got the Australian ones.
Very good. Thank you very much. No, that's lovely. Thank you very much.
Would you thank the panel, please? We've got. If we have time for Q&A.
Yes, we do have time for Q&A. Our lunch is not until 1:30. We can go earlier, but if there's, it's such an interesting panel, and while David is here, if there's questions, I can see Robert Hill with his hand up. Wait.
Robert Hill, former politician. I have a question for Fiona. It's heavy transport. What I don't understand is why the OEMs have been so slow in the development of products. Is it a chicken and the egg thing, or are there technical issues? Is it they can't get sufficient power through the fuel cell systems?
That's a very good question. I think that it's a rather sort of diabolical combination of things. Everyone says chicken and egg, and there's something to that. So for those of you who are less familiar with why we'd be saying that, it's because the OEMs, so the car manufacturers, the vehicle manufacturers, they say, well, we won't bring vehicles out unless we know there's infrastructure to refuel those vehicles. And then those who might be thinking about putting in refueling infrastructure, so governments and others, say, well, why would we do that if there's no vehicles? And so everyone's kind of waiting for the other one to go first, and each one sort of also can't act unless the other one goes. So it's created this sort of standoff. I think we've evolved to the point now where whilst people do talk the chickens and the eggs all the time, and there's a lot of them in hydrogen, it's like sort of full Matryoshka dolls of chickens and eggs. The reality is you do need to do both together, and you kind of need to start, if you have to start with something, it is the infrastructure. Now, the OEMs still have been a bit slow. It appears to be because Australia is just too small a market. Too small a market. We drive on the wrong side of the road for some of the other key markets. We have different Australian design rules associated with, say, the trucks, for example. So trucks are, I think it's 2.55 versus 2.54, in terms of the metres and the width. The reasons given for why the OEMs aren't bringing out those vehicles is we've got other markets that are large, that are easily more sort of scalable because you've got the similar sorts of vehicles. And why would we be prioritising Australia when you also don't have fuel standards, you don't have vehicle standards? Why would that be a thing? So the challenge is actually Australia demonstrating, and possibly we can't because the market is the market, but how do we demonstrate to the sort of the motherships of Toyota and Hyundai and some of the Daimler in Germany and the others to say, actually bet on us. And yes, there's a risk to be borne because we are a smaller market, and there's Australian conditions are also diabolical. I think the nature of our dust in the Pilbara has sort of very unique qualities to destroy all engines. So how do we do all that? And then the design process itself takes 7 years.
Can I just add some of that? A lot of that's going on already at the moment. 6 weeks ago, 8 weeks ago, I was at a factory in Dandenong South, which is the industrial part of Melbourne, handing over a grant for $5 million to a hydrogen fuel cell company. Now, they're already building fuel cell engines that are going into commercial vehicles, passenger vehicles, building small energy provision, etc. And part of that $5 million is going into a second hydrogen storage and topping up facility. There's one already in Melbourne. There's also, just around the corner from that factory, and I've introduced them now, they're working together. There's an Australian company building EV trucks, zero emission trucks, going from 2.4 tonne up to 4.4 tonne. So the little delivery ones up to your larger rubbish trucks, that size of thing. So we are actually doing it here in Australia at the moment. Now, is it at scale? They can't keep up with everything. They're selling everything they're building, and and certainly over the last 3 years, the government has done a lot to try and foster a lot of that homegrown technology, such that some of these commercialities can kick in and drive a lot more of what we're trying to do.
You also do need to be careful, though, that there's a difference between someone assembling a truck using a body that came from an OEM and putting it together with maybe their own or someone else's fuel cell versus an OEM sending over a full piece. And
sure.
that's the bit where we've got the issue where I'm talking OEMs not doing things as fast as we would like. That's the kind of argument. But yes, there are these other smaller ones that are assembling vehicles.
But using their own technology and their own IP. But on EVs, just touching on EVs quickly, it's important. It's something that I've been pursuing and looking at and talking to every company, every organisation. The big trigger that we had to hit was financing companies and the banks couldn't decide on what the residual of an EV fleet was going to be or vehicle was going to be. They know for a petrol-powered vehicle, it's 52%. They couldn't put that number on it, so they wouldn't finance EV fleets until they came up with that. They've now done that. CommBank have big ads at the airport saying, we will finance your EV fleets. Now we're going to see companies just take that on because no one's going to want that residual on a powered vehicle in 5 years' time is going to be a lot lower than that 52%. So I think we've hit the tipping point on EVs where you're going to see very rapid take-up of EVs over the next 2 years. Any other questions?
Yeah, I've got, you wait your turn. Just a question on current fuel supplies. A lot of what we've been talking about is hydrogen in the future. We've probably seen in Ukraine what can actually happen to supply chains. Obviously, there's some risk in the southeast area. Do we need to do anything at the moment to actually look at our current fuel supplies and make sure we do actually have security of fuel supplies over the next couple of years?
Tricky question. The short answer is yes. It's probably the short answer, and the combination of that can take many folds. So if we take a step back, I heard a number this morning at another thing that I was at that it's going to take $9 trillion to upgrade the energy system. That's a significant investment. $9 trillion, phenomenal to get that in. So in terms of security, if it's just gas, yes, sure, get more supply and more storage. I think what we're seeing in the current market, and if it continues, for 2 or 3 years with the challenges in the geopolitical context, the storage is just short. We don't have the storage systems in place, and that's why we need things, when you eventually get scale, to bring in things like hydrogen, which can be stored, and you don't lose vapours, or you don't lose emissions, or you don't lose gas from it just being in a container. And it needs to work together. I was really chuffed at Fiona's point, where she's saying you get on LinkedIn and people are picking fights with each other. It's not useful. I sit there, we need to get more renewables into the system. So if you think about energy consumption, the Department of Industry's report says, I think 18-19 was 52% coal, 26% gas, 7% renewables. The 19-20 was 46% coal, 30% gas, 7% renewables. And so there's a lot of work that needs to be done in the immediate term to bring the renewables, bring the wind online, like David talked about in Victoria. I think the Star of the South is the project, and it's the biggest in the Southern Hemisphere. Bring that wind project online and get it going, but in the meantime, find a supply gap filler in that sense. And I mean, David, you might want to cover that one with Victoria and New South Wales in terms of, but I think that's the challenge. We're in the southeastern states, we've got to try and find the supply and the storage, but it's coming from other regions in our country.
Yeah, and there's lots of storage in Victoria because our gas wells are running out, and they make perfect storage for CCS or whatever. But just the transport costs of getting it down there. But also you need to think about other firming supplies, and this is where hydrogen will be the biggest thing. Currently we rely on, I think it's 23 gigawatts of coal to firm up our grid. Now, we could switch to renewables for all our electricity tomorrow, but if we don't have pumped hydro, if we don't have hydrogen, I can't see batteries in the near future ever, becoming grid scale. But to David's point before, you're using your car at night to run the fridge, while you charge it at work during the day. It makes perfect sense. Using smart grids, but without those firming, we will all see blackouts. It's as sure as that. So, being able to, whether it's through CCS and peaking gas plants or whichever part of the mix, there's just a lot of moving parts in energy, and the simple cry of just more renewables, which we keep on hearing, and we heard loud and clear at this last election, is just too. It simplifies the problem just too much. Now, that said, we probably didn't say enough about what our ambitions were. We talked about what we've done and what we're doing, rather than when it seems like everyone just wanted to hear a bigger number. I think there's lessons to be learnt there. Whether that would have changed things or not, I don't know.
Maybe if I could just sort of give you a reflection. So there was a report that came out, I think it was about 6 months ago, another one's due in 3 weeks. Off the top of my head, I can't remember who it's from. But if you take gas as a wholesale fuel supply of your gas bill, the actual wholesale price only makes up somewhere between 16 and 30% of their bill. So that what you get and what's then produced into energy or gas, it's no more than 30% of the bill. So in that inherent, and then I think it was 60%, or between that gap of 40 to 60%, then becomes distribution, powering, generation.
And electricity is not...
Electricity and the infrastructure associated with. So that's the other context. The other thing I would say around what often gets lost in energy security is energy efficiency. I think as a community, as an Australian community, we need to be better at how we actually use our energy. I think a lot of the pressure on energy prices now is because, Victoria, I'm a Victorian, it's 4 degrees overnight, and I live in a 100-year-old home with no insulation. Now I'm spending money putting double glazing in and things like that. That's a cost. Yeah. And if you contextualise it, double glazing windows, reverse fill insulation, and change the gas heater for electricity, you're up at about $100,000, which is 30 grand more than the average Australian wage. And so I think the dilemma is not so much just about energy security, but it's about efficiency and how we can work through the efficiency conundrum as well.
Damien.
To the former Prime Minister, if you had, in your time as the PM, What was the issue? It might not have been about energy, but what was the issue that kept you awake at night, thinking we're too reliant here in England on getting this commodity from somewhere else? And I suppose if Bryce was the Australian Prime Minister, what would be the issue that would worry you most right now? So,
the issue that keeps you awake at night is your armed forces that are sent into dangerous combat in Afghanistan or fighting ISIL in Iraq and Syria. During my time, there are a number of conflicts: Libya, Afghanistan, the tail end of Iraq, the battle against ISIL in Syria and Iraq. That definitely keeps you awake at night because you are ultimately responsible. And I think the situation we had, particularly with those people who were taken hostage in the Syrian desert, who were beheaded by ISIL, and those appalling videos, and those families who were suffering so much, that really kept you awake at night because you're desperately keen to help them and to do something. We refused, as Australians do, we would not pay ransoms for terrorist kidnap because that just encourages more hostage taking. But trying to find those people and neutralize them, that was the thing that kept you awake most at night and dealing with them. And thank God that we did. We actually built a whole national drone capacity so we could actually act ourselves as well as alongside American allies. We rescued hostages in various parts of the world. And having that capacity is incredibly important. So that was what kept me awake at night. On this issue, as I said, on energy security, I think, power cuts and power shortages and outages are politically disastrous. I mean, they're not economically good either if you have to put your car industry on a 3-day week or what have you, but I think they have a sort of potential for political disaster. So that definitely worries you. And I agree with what's been said. I'm all for renewables, but you've got to deal with the intermittency issue, you've got to have capacity mechanisms, you've got to have things that are going to make sure that the lights stay on. And I think one of the difficulty in this whole area is you've got to work out what is definitely going to happen from what might happen, what is desirable and hopeful, and what technology might deliver, as opposed to what we absolutely know. I think the one thing we absolutely know is we are going to need a lot of electricity generation. If we're moving to electric cars, away from petrol cars and diesel cars, we're going to need a lot of electricity generation. So focus on the things you know you're going to have to do and make sure you deliver those. Lots more examination of supply chains and all the rest of it. And then encourage the widest amount of technology to bring forward, to let 1,000 flowers bloom and hope that some of them will really help us. That's the way I think I approached it. I think someone also have to ask about being Australian Prime Minister. Being Prime Minister of one country was enough.
Well, I'll give it a shot. Who's going to vote for me? Right, so look, I think the current Australian Prime Minister, or the recent Australian Prime Ministers, if you were going to ask them, or the Defence Minister indeed, would probably have said some sort of contingency on Taiwan. And I'm happy to talk about that. But the thing that I think is more of a threat, something that we should be focused on, and it goes to some of the sort of issues that David was just talking about, is the threat of food security as a result of the war in Ukraine. I don't need to go on about how much wheat Ukraine exports, but the 5th largest wheat importer in the world, I think, is it's 5th is Indonesia. Instant noodles are a staple for many people around the region closest to us, Southeast Asia. We're going to find that not only a lot of people are going to go hungry. Another stat, just for fun, is that Ukraine, I think, is the top wheat exporter to 21 of the world's countries. We're going to find a lot of the world is going to be short on carbohydrates, necessity for life. We're going to find that people are going to become desperate, are going to become angry, and that's a recipe for extremism. And if we're not looking at that, and if we're not looking at solutions to that, if we're constantly focused, as I said, on these more traditional security issues, then we might be badly surprised in years going forward.
Plus the movement of people. I completely agree with that. I was in Egypt the other day, a country of 100
10 million people. They import a quarter of what they import, I think, in terms of grain, comes from Ukraine. Bread prices there are already doubling, trebling. It won't take much for people for there to be famines, and as you say, then massive people movements, and whether that's across the Mediterranean or boats from Sri Lanka, as we're taking off this morning. I mean, they're going to, So ultimately, we've got to think, how do we have long-term solutions to these problems rather than just quick fixes?
And they have knock-on effects for the environment as well. So, for example, Ukraine I think it exports half the world's sunflower oil. Now, when people don't have sunflower oil, they need to find a replacement. The replacement in Southeast Asia is palm oil, which is terribly bad for the environment. It's also terribly bad for people's nutrition. So, the Ukraine crisis is creating all sorts of problems and compounding all sorts of environmental problems that we wouldn't think of when we simply say, well, it's a state-on-state a war that involves this one resource, right? There is, as I said at the beginning of my talk, there is a nexus here. It involves water, it involves food, it involves petrochemicals, and it involves climate. And we have to be looking at it as a complete sort of systemic conflict rather than just two countries going at it and what it means for traditional security in Europe.
And on the back of that, I said in a speech in the last Parliament, that I think what we're facing with Ukraine, that and everyone, NATO and particularly Europe sitting back and not doing more, I think in months or maybe years to come, we might look back and go, oh, that might have been an easier decision to make and to take back then, rather than dealing with all these flow-on effects that I think we're going to see if the war continues. Unless there's another question, I'm going to draw it to an end there. A couple of things I think you should read, though. Alan Finkel's quarterly essay on Towards Net Zero is an incredibly good piece to be able to read. It's just come out, but in Foreign Affairs magazine this month, there's a couple of really good articles on the new geopolitics of energy and how governments are going to have to approach what's going on with Ukraine. So just a couple of pieces there that I think will help you understand a lot of what's going on in this geopolitical context. Whether that's affecting the energy security or not, part of it is, part of it isn't. But can I ask you to put your hands together for our panel? Thank you.